and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right, moving on to item 2A, minutes of the regular city council meeting on October 25th, 2022. I'd entertain a motion to approve those minutes.
So moved.
Motion is second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. The minutes pass. Item 2B, minutes of the city council work session on October 25th, 2022. We have a motion to approve those minutes.
So moved.
Motion is second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Those minutes are approved. Moving on to item 3, adoption of the agenda. Are there any corrections or amendments to the agenda?
Comment about the consent agenda. Do I do it now or do I do it at the next point?
If you want to, when we take up the consent agenda, we'll have a discussion on that. That's fine. So with that, I'd entertain a motion to adopt the agenda.
So moved.
Second.
If motion is second, all those in favor of adopting the agenda, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. We have an agenda. Moving on to item 4, the consent agenda. I would entertain a motion to approve the consent agenda.
I don't know how to bring it up, Mr. Mayor.
So
Sorry.
when we get do I have a second?
Second.
I have a motion and a second. Is there any discussion on the consent agenda? Councilwoman Hughes.
I suppose I could just discuss it here, simply that there are comments made in the in consent agenda A, acceptance of minutes for the various commissions, Planning Commission, Park Advisory Commission, and I'm curious if we will discuss the results of any of those commissions, specifically the Park Advisory Commission, but any of them in the future, if there's a plan to delve into them, or if this is we approve their minutes and we don't look at it again.
I can share what my intent is specific to one of the notes on the Park Commission, specifically the dog beach, now that it's effectively closed for the year. It's my intent to take that up this winter or sometime before it reopens so that the council can digest what the Park Commission has to say and then make a decision on whether or not we're going to continue with that. Ms. Crawford.
Thank you, Mayor, members of the council. We are planning to have a January work session with each of the boards and commissions, and that is when I was planning to have that discussion with the Park Board, City Council, staff, and the report that has been put together, which I believe staff is still finalizing.
Great. Thank you.
All right, I have a motion and a second. All those in favor of approving the consent agenda say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. The consent agenda is adopted. Item 5, visitors and presentations. We have nothing scheduled. Item 6, public hearings, nothing scheduled. Item 7, unfinished business, nothing scheduled. So we have item 8A, new business, resolution accepting bids and awarding construction contract for the public safety renovation project, city project number 22-09. Mr. Copy.
All right, thank you, Mr. Mayor, members of the council. A lot of the initial part of this presentation will just kind of be recapping for those who may be watching in the audience or at home. So again, just to recap the project scope, as we have discussed a number of times over the last year, most recently at a workshop in October. So the scope of the project is to replace the fire apparatus bay, addition of a police garage, remodel the interior space of the building, change some things up operationally, such as adding dorms, decontamination rooms to bring things up to code, update the break room and kitchen area. Again, along with some needed facility updates, some HVAC, roof replacement, garage doors that actually fit the equipment that we have, and obviously indoor parking for our valuable assets, our police cars and other equipment. We will also add secure staff parking as part of the project. And one thing that council had directed is to have a public display of the La France fire truck. Next slide. Here's just an overview of the site campus. Shows the new location of starting at the west side of the site, the new secure staff parking, which will be fenced in with key card access gates. We have the new police garage. You can see the new drive-through fire apparatus bay that'll enter and exit both off of 2nd Street there. Next slide. This next slide really just shows which areas are new and which areas are being renovated. The area in green is the interior renovations for the public safety, police and fire. The red area is the new apparatus bay. Just to the north of that is the, in a darker red, is the decontamination areas. And then the orange is the fire support space. Blue is the new police garage that will house all of their equipment and vehicles. And then on the north side, you can see in the purple is a required storm shelter that's required by code today to accommodate the uses of our building. Here's just a couple of aerial views looking at the campus, what it'll look like after completion. Next slide. Here are the site elevations as we had discussed at our last workshop that will remain as part of the project, with the exterior elevations taking materials from all the different city buildings to kind of make a cohesive site and kind of tie all our buildings together. Here is a view looking north off of 2nd Street that shows the display area that will show off the LaFrance fire truck, as well as at the same time providing or maintaining a secure area for our fire. Next slide. Here is a slide that's looking northeast. This is where the fire trucks and the police will exit the facility and then head on to 2nd Street and then out onto their calls. You can see I'll go back one slide. You can see off to the left of the slide the secure fencing. It will be that wrought iron fence from the north and south, and then a composite wood type fence along the adjacent residential properties to provide some screening. Next slide. This slide just looking northwest. This is looking at the new fire apparatus bay and the fire training tower, and you can kind of see the city hall in the left side of the screen. Next slide. So getting on to project costs and funding, as we discussed at the last council workshop, we originally had a budget before going into bids at $14.7 million. After the bids came out, we had a bid opening on October 11th. We had $17.8 million, so quite a swing. We discussed that at the last workshop, where just the market and the construction industries, just double-digit increases that drove us to where we're at. Kind of going over to the cost side of it, you can see the $17.8 million. We're going to delay 2 items based on that workshop discussion. The monument out front, we can add that at a later date. We'll prep the site and have that ready for it, but we'll delay that installation. We'll also delay the roof replacement. Both those items we'll reevaluate as we go through the project, depending on cost savings as we go through with our contingencies. As far as funding goes, and I'll let Carrie or Lindy jump in as needed, but we'll do 2 bond issuances, one this year as the 22B issuance. The 23A will begin almost immediately, so that we'll have that early in 2023. A couple of the other items that will fund the project are interest earned on the bond proceeds as we go through the project. We get a lot of the money up front, so we'll have some investment opportunity to gain interest on that. Secondly, we will have a sales tax rebate based on the materials that are used on the project. So we'll do that on an annual basis as we go through the project. And anything left that we need to carry things over would be out of the Community Reinvestment Fund right now, showing at just over $100,000 to carry us through the project. That again is all dependent on how we end up with our contingency and how the project goes. So next up, project schedule-wise. The top part is just to kind of recap where we've been. Next steps, tonight, November 9th, we are going to present in front of council that they would award the construction contracts. If they're awarded tonight, we anticipate construction to actually begin with interior renovations in March of next year. And it'll be about a 16-month or so build out. So June 2024 will be substantially complete. We'll do minor restorations, cleanings, things like that beyond that. So That's where we're at project schedule-wise. You want to flip to the last slide? So one thing I want to point out is kind of a last-minute change. You should all have received the amended resolution. The elevator company, who originally was going to withdraw their bid based on what they believed was an error, said that they could do the work within the bid that they submitted. So we accepted that bid and amended this resolution to also include work scope 14B for elevator for Otis Elevator Company based on their base bid. So that being said, staff would recommend that council adopt the attached resolution awarding the contracts, or the amended resolution awarding the contract for the public safety facility renovation project.
Thank you, Mr. Copy. So just as a housekeeping matter, so the council's clear what Mr. Copy said, the resolution, the amended resolution that's before us that includes WS 14B, the elevator, is the resolution that's before the council, should someone decide to move it. Couple just introductory remarks. First of all, I want to compliment the council on the work session that we had on October 25th. As the meetings note, we started that at 8:23 and we adjourned a little after 11:04. I say that for those that are in the audience and maybe watching at home. We took a lot of time on this because the original budget was 14.7 million, and then the bids came in at over 17 million. So it was a huge price jump, and I think everybody in the council took that to heart, and everybody was committed to the project, myself included. This obviously predates my time as mayor and being on the council, but I support the project, and I think it's overdue, and it's part of those essential city services that we need to provide for our residents as best we can, and this will help us do that. So. Again, I want to compliment the council. I thought we did a great job, and some of the creative things that we came up with was, one, to cut as much fat as we could. I think the delay the monument was a good thing because that doesn't help us provide better police, fire, ambulance services, so that was an easy one to cut. And then we're delaying the replacement of the roof on the rest of the building, which I'm told can wait. So we did a good job sharpening our pencils. I also think we made a smart decision by dipping a little bit into the community reinvestment fund. There's several $1 million there that is part of why we have that, is so that we can help out in projects like this and ultimately grease the skids to make it work. The big thing that the council placed a priority on was not exceeding $10 million in bonding in one single year, because crossing that threshold not only changes the economics and that we pay a little bit more to borrow the money in interest rate, but it would mark a significant departure from anything that the city's ever done. So I say that because it's important for folks to know that we took a hard line on doing this as frugally as we can, but ultimately delivering what will be a project that we're all proud of once it's all said and done. So I support this project. I support this resolution. I'm excited to move forward. I think the council's mainly on board as well. So with that, I will throw it to the council for questions for Mr. Copy or comments on this project. Or a motion.
Move to approve.
I have a motion. Do I have a second?
Second.
Motion is second. Any further discussion on this? Seeing none.
Said it well.
No.
Summed it up.
Very good. So I have a motion and a second. Without any further discussion, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? The motion carries and the resolution passes. Moving on to item 8B, resolution providing the sale of general obligation capital improvement plan bonds series 2022B. Ms. Kinsvater.
Mr. Mayor, members of the council, as we've discussed as part of the public safety facility renovation and expansion project, we'll be issuing 2 bond issues. You described, Mr. Mayor, perfectly that our goal is to remain under the $10 million annual limit of when we issue the bonds. When we issue under $10 million in 1 year, the banks are qualified to bid on our purchases, and so we increase our number of potential bidders, and then there are lower interest rates that come with those issues. So very prudent to do that. So this bond sale that's presented to you tonight is the first of the 2 bond sale issues. It's for $6,990,000. We took the $10 million for the year, subtracted out the bonds that we issued for the street improvement project earlier this year, and that is how we came up with our $6 million number. So The preliminary debt service schedules that were prepared by Ellers and that were in the packet were for planning purposes. They use the market rate at the time for issuers with a AA plus bond rating, and we have the AA plus bond rating, and they added an additional 75 basis points just to cushion for any potential changes in the interest rate that would happen between them issuing their report and when we sell the bonds. So that 75 basis points is 0.75%. So based on that information, they took the market rate at the date, they added on the basis points. So the true interest cost for this bond issue is 4.5%, just over 4.5%. So when we talk about the true interest cost, that's really the actual interest cost of borrowing the funds, taking into account the coupon rates and then the underwriters' discounts or premium when we issue the bonds. So based on those assumptions, we'd be looking at our bond would have 20 years of principal payments. So based on all of those assumptions, the annual tax levy will range between slightly over $372,000 and $566,000 during the life of the bonds. As part of this bond process, the staff has been working with S&P Global Ratings and Ellers because we're required to have a ratings review. So they look at our financial data, they ask us quite a few questions just to analyze what our rating is. And we were notified on Monday that S&P, based on their review, they affirmed our AA plus bond rating for this issue. So they give us the AA plus bond rating for this issue, and they affirmed it for all of the debt that we've issued. So it's very exciting. In their letter that they sent to us, that their view of the city is that there's very strong economy, and we have access to a broad metropolitan base, being so close to the Minneapolis-St. Paul area. So our economy is good, and their economy is good. We have strong budgetary performance and strong management with good financial policies, our long-term financial forecasting, and our capital planning. So I think that speaks to the hard work that the council has been doing with our finances to make sure that we're planning for these purchases. So with that, I recommend that the council adopt the resolution authorizing Ellers to assist in the bond sale. We would establish November 22nd, 2022 as the meeting to consider the bond sale proposals, and setting November 22nd, 2022 as the date for awarding the bond sale, and that we would authorize Ellers and city staff to participate in the preparation of the official statement for the bonds. We do have Dan Tentner with Ellers here at this meeting, so if there's any questions that the council may have that they'd like to ask Dan to as part of this process, either of us were available to answer the questions.
Thank you. Council, any questions on this? Seeing none, I'd entertain a motion to approve the resolution.
Approve. Second.
I have a motion, a second. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries and the resolution passes. Item 9, discussion A. 9A, that is land use and zoning application review process. Mr. Lindahl.
Thank you, Mayor, members of the council. So just to highlight a couple things before we get started here, again, this item appears under your discussion section of your agenda. So we're really just rolling out this idea for feedback and discussion by the council. No action is expected and nothing results except direction to staff from this item. The item that we're talking about here tonight basically is looking at refining some of our land use and zoning review processes. It really results from direction that the council provided during work sessions last summer when you started reviewing the Housing Task Force report in your work sessions in June and July of this year. So in those work sessions, you looked at that report and the 4 broad recommendations that came out of that report, which are shown up here on the slide. The third and you assigned the priorities and work of those four goals as it's shown up here on the slide. So the third action, guiding future development, was assigned to the Planning Commission. And so the that guiding future development really kind of includes two components. The first one will be started next year, and that's a broader review and update of the city's zoning standards. But the second one is just a processing point that has come up in discussions as part of some of the recent applications that have come through the city. And so we decided that process-wise, we could look at those ones separately and try to be better prepared for anything else that may come our way as we see future development proposed in the city. So the Planning Commission was assigned this task, and they started looking at this at their last meeting. So staff presented the same outline of these things that we'll talk about here tonight and took feedback from them. Generally, the Planning Commission was, excuse me, very supportive of this process. They felt that they were encouraged to see that the city was trying to be proactive, to have some broader engagement and earlier engage the community with, the more whole scale or broader redevelopment projects or planning projects that may come through the city at any given time. And so they had questions as part of their discussion about how this could affect timing of applications, what kind of costs could be incurred. And generally, the city's staff's response was, in working through this, similar kinds of processes in other communities and seeing how they've played out in other communities as well, that there will be some extra time and cost that's incurred by developers to do this. However, it's been staff's experience that developers find value in these processes because of the ability to get involved with the community in front of the Planning Commission and City Council earlier in their process, and before they have to develop a full kind of final plan set that usually comes through the formal review process. And so they do find value in these processes. So what I wanted to do was take a look at the neighborhood meeting process first. I'll outline some things here. We can certainly have discussion or questions at any point. Feel free to stop me at any time. And much more detail is included in your staff reports. But looking at the neighborhood meeting process, the city has used this in an informal way on a few redevelopment projects. Schaefer Richardson had neighborhood meetings that were part of it. But up to this point, we didn't have a formal process and kind of standards that we could hand in a clear manner to the developer, or that we can share with the public so they can actually see, right on a piece of paper or right on our website what the process is, and so they can follow it more clearly. Okay, so again, the intent here is, again, to get more information out to the public and them involved earlier. So the neighborhood meeting would be required to be hosted by the developer. It's their meeting. So oftentimes it's staff, or I think the public comes in and sees a meeting where they were already into a formal application, and we're in a formal meeting here at City Hall where they think the process is maybe further along than it really is. This really gives both the public some opportunity to comment earlier in the process, and the developer to be able to, react and revise or adjust their plans with that project or with that feedback. City officials and staff are invited to the meetings, but again, the developer hosts the meetings and has that interaction and presentation with the public. We're really there to answer procedural questions like, do they really need a plan unit development, or what kind of deviations from the zoning code could they need? Would they go to Planning Commission? Dates for official meetings, those kinds of things. But the developer is, again, responsible for hosting that meeting. The neighborhood meetings would be part of the concept plan review, which is the next thing we're going to talk about here. So that this is a component of that next process we'll talk about here in a second. And then part of any conditional use permit or rezoning process that is either within or directly kind of abutting or adjacent to a residential area. So if we're talking about projects that are, out by 35, away from people, just part of an industrialized area, this isn't a requirement as proposed right now, but certainly that's open to discussion from the council and feedback from the council. These meetings would need to occur at least 1 week before the planning commission process, so we can make sure that we get the feedback from the neighbors and that the developer then relays that information to staff so we can include it in the report that goes to the planning commission. The notice mechanism or part of this process is very similar to what the community or the council would be used to for a public hearing. It's 10 days, they need to provide notice 10 days prior to the meeting. It's the same notification distance, approximately 350 feet as it stands right now. But again, that distance and that timing are all open for feedback from the planning commission. Copies of the notices would go to those residents within that area, but then also to the members of the city council, the planning commission, and the community development director, so we can monitor that process and attend if you like. The results of the meeting, the applicant's required to take notes or minutes of that meeting, offer a sign-in sheet so people can keep a record and that they can sign in at will for, take comment cards or comment sheets during the meeting and provide us minutes back from those meetings. The way that we have structured this process to date is there is that modifications section that's included right now that if you've looked in there more closely, you'd see. That's really intended for the city to be able to have options to modify this process should there be something unforeseen that we haven't thought about. Really, this came into, it was something that was added in the last community I worked in as part, basically as a reaction to COVID, when it wasn't safe for the public to actually gather together and have a public meeting. And so we pivoted in those situations and had online meetings and had the applicant host a website that allowed for comment and that kind of thing. So it's intended, again, for the city to only have options. It states in there very clearly it's not intended for the applicant to be able to get around this process in some way. So that's a quick overview of the neighborhood meeting process. We can move on to concept plan and kind of see how these things fit together, or I can answer any questions anybody has right now. Okay. So looking at the concept plan, again, neighborhood meetings are one component of this. But the idea here is that this pre-application concept plan review would allow the developers to come in and get, again, feedback from the public, the planning commission, and council prior to submitting a formal application. This process is unique in that it's not a formal entitlement process. So the review, the comments, the feedback from the public, the planning commission, staff, or the council is all advisory. It doesn't bind the city or the applicant to anything. It is really just an opportunity for these more significant land use applications that we'll talk about here in a minute for what it applies to. For those more significant applications to be out in front of the public early in the process to allow the public to be more well-informed and engaged about these processes or these projects that could affect their neighborhoods. So this would apply to applications, again, for concept plan, but also for it would be optional for projects, but could be required for any comprehensive plan amendment, again, the more major kind of projects, rezonings, plan unit developments or PUD projects, or any project that may request city financial assistance. Again, this process doesn't bind the council or the city to anything related to any of those projects. It just allows a more open dialogue to happen related to those things. So So then the process for looking at those concept plans would begin with the neighborhood meeting like I had just outlined in the previous slide. So the applicant hosts that meeting, presents the project to the public, and gets feedback. And then the next step would be to have the the project go on to the Planning Commission. That's intended to be a follow-up to the neighborhood meeting, and would build upon that process. So so what would happen is the neighborhood meeting would occur, be hosted by the developer. Information and feedback would be gathered at that process. And then the next step would be then to have a more, what I think is kind of traditional review by the Planning Commission, City Council. It would go to the Planning Commission, have an informal meeting, allow the Planning Commission or the developer to make a presentation. Staff would have a general report about the scope of the project and how it might fit within the zoning standards, but wouldn't make a formal recommendation. The public would be invited to comment, and planning commissioners would be provided the opportunity to give feedback. And then again, no formal recommendation is part of that process. Again, it's the opportunity to get comments and information early in the process. And then again, kind of building on that process, the neighborhood meeting occurs, the planning commission meeting occurs, they build that information and bring it all to the council, where you also have the same kind of process, developer-led presentation, staff informs that process and gives some context to the Planning Commission and provides all the public feedback that has occurred up to that point, and then provides an opportunity for the council to ask questions and have conversations directly with the potential developer. As far as next steps and kind of results of that process, it really just results in more information for the public and the council and the developer, for the developer then to use as they see fit, which would be to allow or use that information to put forward a future formal application if they choose to do so. So that's a quick run through of both of those options. So at this point, again, no formal action is requested by the council tonight. We're just looking for feedback from you. We'd be happy to discuss a few scenarios if we did some similar scenario discussion with the Planning Commission as part of their questions. So just anticipating that, we'd be happy to talk through a few of those if that helps the council. But then we'd be looking for feedback with the idea that we'd take that feedback and start preparing a future ordinance amendment for the council and the Planning Commission to consider.
Thank you, Mr. Lindo. Well, this being a discussion, let me kick things off. First off, for members of the audience, the public, a little bit of backstory about what the genesis of this was. It was decided at a work session among the council, some on the council, myself included, that the city could do a better job when it came to transparency and consistency. And I think this speaks to that. Transparency meaning we involve the community, and consistency having some formal process that isn't subject to whoever staff person's whims are that day, or some predictability to the process. It was also prompted in part by public feedback and, quite candidly, accusations that, hey, the city's a year into a project and then we feel like we haven't even heard about it. So this speaks to that. It gives the public an opportunity to share their ideas and thoughts early enough in the process so that if we think it's a really bad idea, it remains and dies a bad idea and we move on to the next thing. Or if we think it is a good idea, that we can address some of the concerns that can make it possible early enough. So against that backdrop, you're looking for feedback from the council. I think this is great. We're absolutely on the right track. Is this the finished product? Probably not. I'm sure members on the council have some suggestions for picking and tweaking it a little bit, but this, to me, speaks to the heart of transparency and consistency. So I'll put it this way. If the city moves forward with a project the council votes to approve a project and certain people in the community don't like it, that's one thing, that's inevitable. You're never going to get 100% buy-in on any project. But it's quite another if people in the community feel blindsided, like they never had a chance to be heard. That, I think, is not acceptable. And I think this process speaks directly to solving, I don't want to call it a problem because I don't think it was a problem. I just think we can improve on it and do better than we have done in the past. And this, I think, shores up sort of that blind spot that maybe we at one time did have. So that's my feedback. This is absolutely on the right track. I think the early neighborhood meeting and putting the onus on the developer to organize that and spearhead it very early in the process is exactly what we need. So I support this and would welcome, it moving along and us, actually putting pen to paper and approving it and having a formal process. So those are my thoughts. Anyone else on the council? Councilmember Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I concur with everything you said. I would just add, the process of voicing concern, the squeaky wheel, the loudest voice, as I've learned in 15 years, gets heard the most. And people don't want to stand up to that. And so there is the silent, I don't want to say the word, but minority, majority, whatever it is, that doesn't. I would like to see a process that there is a written, verbal, online, not verbal, online, whatever, a different process where they don't have to get up in a room full of people shouting them down. That's the biggest negative that I've seen in the situations, is that people who have something to say are just afraid of public speaking, of getting up in front of and dealing with an opposite viewpoint. And it doesn't matter which one it is either. So but I think this is great also too. Great. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
So, Mr. Lindo, have other cities done something that really speaks specifically to that? I know we have some different things in here, processes and websites and different things. Is that something we can add to it as an option or a supplement to the formal neighborhood discussion?
Mayor, members of the council, you actually asked, I think, a great question that did actually come up as part of the Planning Commission meeting as well, in a little bit different kind of context. But what staff shared with the Planning Commission at the time, and what I hope would address your concerns here, is one thing we've learned that I think was helpful as we looked at how to improve this process, especially during COVID, was requiring the applicant to have a website that not only do the neighbors get a notice in the mail like they're used to getting for a public meeting or a city process, but that notice, that invitation to that meeting includes a website, again, that the developer hosts that shows, the basic concepts of their plans, some site plans, some elevations, that kind of thing, and a basic narrative about unit count or uses or that kind of thing. And so, and some context within the neighborhood and to where they might be able to see their house in that context, their home, their own property in that context. And then it gives the opportunity to submit online comments right on that website. And it provides what we found to be effective, a direct phone number to those residents who want to talk directly to the developer in that instance. Because really at this page, at this stage, we're only talking about a concept plan. This isn't a formal land use application where the city has certain legal processing and documentation requirements and obligations. In this point, it's really a conversation between the developer and the neighborhood that the city just needs to kind of play referee a little bit on, call balls and strikes and talk about process and make sure we're within the boundaries of what they're talking about. But really, it's a conversation at the neighborhood level. And that website opportunity gives, I would hope, a little bit more comfort level to those that either don't feel comfortable about their particular opinion, either for or against the project, or just in the way we found we can use the internet and websites more effectively to gain broader public engagement because you can send your comment, at 9 o'clock when you're done getting your kids to hockey, and you have 10 minutes to send some projects or some comments where maybe you couldn't get to the actual meeting and talk with your neighbors. So we're hopeful that particular element of this, that we can, again, document in the more detailed ordinance that would come to you, would cover that concern.
No, very good. I'll just echo one other thing to Councilmember Jones' point, and I think it's a fair one. People just might not be comfortable. People might not be comfortable speaking. This is still a representative body. I mean, our email addresses, our phone numbers are on the city's website, so contact myself, contact the other members of the council. There are certainly opportunities to make your voice heard, short of a formal presentation or public speaking in front of all your neighbors. So that's always available. It's always been available. That's never going away. This just, supplements that. So I hear your concerns. I think that's all good and well. Please.
I mean, with the combination of the website plans, all one-stop shop, I don't have to grab an email address, I don't have to go front end to down. I think that's awesome. That's fantastic, because I get to see the plans right there, or whatever is provided, and there's my one. I'm done. I think that's fantastic.
Any other comments? Councilmember Walsh.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I support the plan. I support the idea and the concept. My fear is, I'll just raise it, and we can talk it through, maybe you figured this through, but you say it's not the formal process, but it could replace the formal process. And we've had a couple of times, even before we've done this, where we've had developers come forward, we've had community meetings, and we've frankly scared the developer away with a really loud, community response. And I sat back and thought, well, don't give up. We can work with the neighbors. We can work on this, and the council might be supportive. I mean, I can't prejudge, and I'm not going to tell you how I'm going to vote yet, but I'm not scared. Let's talk about it. But the developers say, not worth the effort. We're out. So I have a little bit of a fear that this could kind of replace the formal process, and we could have some of these just kind of pop up, and we're going to have a concept plan, okay, and then we're going to have a neighborhood meeting, and not worth the effort, and we might not get anybody through that to the real process where, I don't want to say cooler heads, but people that are, the planning commission's job is to really go into detail with your staff recommendation. We make a decision, duly elected. So, and we've shown, I think we've proven we're not afraid to make people angry with some votes, some people, and if it's good for the entire city. So I guess if you guys have thought of that or not, we just got to make sure it doesn't replace the formal process. And become the process, and then scare developers away. So maybe your experience on that.
Mayor, members of the council, again, I think a great question that you're raising. So I think the challenge that we have here is, how do we balance providing ample opportunity for the public to be involved early and to get information early with providing so much process that people get confused? So we've got to be careful about that. But we also, as far as more directly to your point about that, could this replace the process? It's important to remember that there are no entitlements that come out of this. And I think the important component that we're adding here to address, more specifically address your concern, is in the past, we've just told developers, go have a neighborhood meeting and then see what you hear. And then in certain projects that they maybe felt like they got a lot of neighborhood pushback on, there wasn't any sort of other process or follow-up that just kind of, as you said, scared off a developer. This process combines that neighborhood meeting with then a process where they actually come and talk to the planning commission, and then build on information from the neighborhood and the planning commission, and then come talk to the council. And the council will have the opportunity to say, this neighborhood feedback we really think is important, and these concerns, I think are, pivotal to you coming forward with any formal land use application. We think, as the mayor, I think, has stated, it allows us to kind of give feedback as we think this is a great idea, or we think this is a really challenging idea for this site, and the neighborhood is backing that perspective. So I think it's the combination of that neighborhood meeting that allows the developer to have that direct conversation, and then combining it with an informal process, but a required one that goes before the planning commission and council to balance that, maybe, as you said, kind of cooler head, broader perspective of the council that's, again, a representative body, as the mayor mentioned, and has more experience with how the land use process is supposed to work.
My other concern, if I could, I don't think we're going to do it, but I just want to say it out loud. I mean, I don't want too much burden on the developers as they come forward. So we're talking about like sketch drawings. They're not hiring architects. They're not going deep into that, right? We're not requiring anything like that on the front end of this because, they shouldn't have to spend money or too much money. I mean, obviously they have a concept already. We've seen some really preliminary stuff that obviously isn't expensive. So that's kind of what you're thinking. Is that what I'm understanding?
Mr. Mayor, members of the council, yes, the idea here is that the concept plans are just that. They're conceptual. And, the members of the public probably don't, know the extensive plans with formal site plans and surveying and architects that do renderings, but then plans for the whole building and specific layouts and all sorts of things that fire and needs to look at for a formal application, or more detailed engineering reviews with stormwater management and those kinds of things. Those kinds of things shouldn't be part of this application because, again, we're having a conceptual discussion with the public about these projects at this point. So, and that's, again, part of what, in my experience, developers have really liked about this, because, if they come in and we just have a neighborhood, we even just required a neighborhood meeting of part of the formal process, when they actually have to have all those things for staff to be able to fully review their project, as you said, they've spent substantial money on preparing for that and investing in that project, and we want to provide that balance between enough investment in plans and concepts that we can provide, some constructive feedback and know what we're talking about. So we're not talking about drawn on the back of a napkin, but we're also not talking about full engineered plans.
No, I think that's a good point. And I want to flesh that out a little bit and stay with it, because I think we're on the same page. So I want to just talk through kind of my hypothetical and make sure I got it straight. I see this process as more, from its most simple form, hey, developer wants to put a 4-story apartment complex there, and we'll parse it out a little bit. But the color, which way it faces, the pitch of the roof, those things that require a lot more money to be spent, we're not getting into that nitty gritty. And that, to your point, that's what I'm after. I want to hear from members of the community, as basic as there's a developer that wants to put an apartment complex there. What do you think? There's all kinds of nuances and a million decisions that are going to get made. But that, to me, is it's good to have that conversation early, because if there's just an outright rebellion, people just don't want it, I want to know about that early. And if people are open to it, we can always figure out what the roof line looks like, and whether it's 3 stories or 4 stories, and whether or not we've got some green space here or there. So we're clear about that. This really is conceptual, and it shouldn't be too costly for a developer to get to this stage and be able to have a fleshed out project pursuant to these rules at that stage, correct?
Correct. Mr. Mayor, members of the council, the only caveat I would say is that, in my experience, I also, do try to balance by telling the developer, you want to put your best foot forward early in this process. Picture's worth 1,000 words. You want to give, and from what I've heard from my brief time here in this community, is design is important in these kinds of projects as they attempt to fit into fully developed neighborhoods. So I think we could expect to see some fairly substantial elevations, but I also would balance that, as you say, the roof line, the color of the exterior materials, whether it's, this percent brick or that amount of siding here, if the building turns in different ways or orients different ways or that kind of, all those things are to be adjusted. But I do think it's important for them to present their best product.
And it has been your experience, because as our city manager just pointed out, we're not reinventing the wheel here.
Right.
This is common in other communities. Has it been your experience that this has proved, unduly burdensome for developers, or, as you said, they kind of like it and they get the process and there's buy-in from the developers, right?
Members of the council, I would say that in the vast majority, high 80% kind of things, developers welcome this project because, again, they know they can make a more reasonable, cost-effective investment and learn about where the community lies with their proposal. And again, we're not talking about doing this for the average resident who wants to build a new garage. We're not talking about doing this for smaller kinds of things. This is for the larger scale, more impactful kinds of projects that really need this kind of feedback to properly fit into the neighborhood that they're trying to be part of.
To that point, I note here in your comments with the Planning Commission that the items that they spoke about that night would go in this process. One of them is, changing a current building from a 14-unit, what must be a business office right now, and making it assisted living. But one of them is, I don't know, a garage for a dentist. And I guess I'm just thinking to myself, and I have a CUP. I don't want a neighborhood meeting for my CUP. That doesn't mean that I wasn't trying to share it. I had to send a letter out, talk to all my neighbors. That's not the thing. It's just that I wasn't going to put together a website for the thing. Again, not because I wanted to hide it, but that would have been a cost. And so I guess I'm just wondering, as you just said, this is supposed to be for kind of bigger things. I guess I don't know about the turning the convent into an assisted living facility. Probably the neighbors would be interested in knowing that, but it's already a building where multiple people sleep or have in theory. And again, the dentist office, I guess the neighbors would probably want to know about it, but it wasn't expanding it to a 14, it wasn't this major expansion. And so these do seem a little bit, it just seems like a very big process for the dentist to put together a website. Not that he shouldn't share the information, but I guess I'm just wondering how, I'm not interested in an actual line, but how far down are we going to push developers at this one? I'm just making no sense, but one of them does clearly have a developer. I guess I don't know that the dentist does or doesn't have a developer. It looks like he just has an architect. Anyway, so that's, I guess, my concern, is that it doesn't seem burdensome. It just seems like, wow, what a process for that kind of a thing, which doesn't really seem like it's what we're after, which I would like to get. I would like to get more community input. I mean, I would like to avoid blow-ups. I would like for people to at least know what's coming down the pike. And so I like the concept. I'm just thinking some of these, I don't know how to, I guess I don't know how small to go.
Mayor, members, I'm sorry, Councilmember Jones.
Same follow-up. That is, does a variance trigger it? Does a PUD, does a CUP, does a zoning change? And how small? I'm like, impervious surface, and I'm being somewhat sarcastic, 2 square feet, boom. That's the slippery slope of what level defines how small. So for example, my neighbor wanted to put in a hair salon next to it that's going to put traffic. I might not like that. So do they now have to, does that, it's just, we need to weed through that, and we can.
Yeah, no, I think to shore up that, and I'll throw it to you, Mr. Lindahl, but we have an applicability section in here, and I think that's what the council's after. We want a nice, tight applicability so that it's clear. I mean, I read this, it probably could be tightened up, but I read this to mean the big projects, the things that require, I agree, Councilmember Hughes, we don't want someone having to go through this for some relatively superficial thing. So maybe you can speak to that. How can we polish up the applicability, and what do other cities do?
Mayor, members of the council, again, I think you raise a great question. And I think, as I said before, staff's intention here, again, is to involve the public early on in the process. And so we always want to balance the providing information to the public. We want to give them as much as we can to help them feel like they are informed and about what's going on in their neighborhood and about a particular project. But then we also have to balance that with provided them so much information that they feel overwhelmed. Similarly, with your concerns about where we draw the line for how this is included. At this point, we've kind of, at the discussion stage, we've given you what we think is kind of the broadest approach. And I think what I've heard from the Planning Commission and from the council now tonight is we want to make sure that we're sharpening our pencils on this and figuring out how to apply this as best possible, again, to manage that, providing information to the public, but not overburdening the applicants or the developers for these projects. And so, to be quite honest with you, there have been situations where I've used this process and the developers have had meetings and had very little public involvement or no public involvement. And then there's situations where they've had, dozens or more people show up. So I think I think that's the challenge with public engagement. But in either of those cases where they had a lot of feedback or where there wasn't any, I think the developers found that useful because they could point to the fact that no one came to their particular meeting as evidence of the level of interest, or that at least they made a full-blown legitimate effort to try and engage the public early. If at some point later on in the project, public shows up to the formal public hearing and says we didn't know about this. So we run that risk kind of either way we go about this, but I think in the end there's value in however it turns out.
Sure. And just to put a final capstone on the applicability, inevitably there's going to be some element of discretion. It'd be nice in some ideal, perfect sense. It's completely objective. There's a clear line. You either fall in it or you don't, but that's just not how the world works. And to a certain extent, we've got to rely on staff to be able to know where that is based on what the appetite for the council is for public engagement. And I can say I trust city staff to implement this, and there'll be some give and take as we go through it. Whatever we put on paper doesn't mean it can't be amended down the road. But I think in terms of tonight, for purposes of discussion and feedback, yeah, that's going to be a concern of the council. So I'd be interested to know, what we can do, what other cities do, how it's worked. Councilmember Hughes.
I guess one thing I'd like to suggest, and I'd like to hear if this seems unreasonable, is to kind of take the residential part out. If someone's just doing something to their house. I mean, obviously, adding a hair salon or doing business out of your house is now business. But to the extent that it's just residential, there's notification already. And so hopefully if your neighbor is mad that you're doing something, that is plenty of notification for them, and then they can just have that conversation to themselves. But that would just be one thing I'd like to suggest, or again, if that's a bad idea, to hear why.
Mayor, members of the council, sorry, if I could just quickly, it wasn't my intent at least to require the residential projects, but more so the very large scale projects that may affect more than just your 3 neighbors, but that may be controversial. And I think that there's room for us to work on the language when we do bring back a text amendment for that.
Okay, thanks.
Councilmember Jones.
So the concept, actually, one of our constituents just texted me this, so they're watching. I don't know why. But thank you. And it reminded me the concept detail thing. It's like, okay, I've seen it go bad both times and waste a lot of time. You put too much detail in. Bel Air, County Road E, too much detail was put in. So they sat there and talked about the restroom colors, all right? It just took down a big part. Not enough detail was given, Third and Cook. Well, that's not, and I'm like, so I don't know what to tell them on that. I mean, that one, because I've seen it go bad either way on both of those. And I don't, public has a tough time seeing something and going, that's permanent. That's what it's going to be. And I don't know how to, and I'm not going to ask city staff to get involved in that referee match, right? Because it's their meeting, but how can it be stated where clearly, but nonetheless,
Well,
it is.
If memory serves me, when we had this work session months ago, that was one of the mandates was some element of public education so that folks knew, sort of a timeline, if you will, or a flow chart of here's what stage you're at. So if you really hate this project and it doesn't get killed at this meeting, well, that's one of like 18 different stages where
Right.
you've got an opportunity. So I think that's where it comes in. Here's what I'm going to envision. City staff can tell me whether this is a stupid idea or whether it's feasible. Some one-pager or little simple flyer that says, here's how an apartment complex is start to finish gets built in White Bear and all the stages of how it goes. So people in the community have an idea of what those stages are, where public input, where you have a chance, because that I think is the disconnect that residents feel like, I missed that public hearing, that meeting with my neighbors. I didn't get a chance to say no, and somehow tomorrow there's going to be a 4-story apartment in my backyard. Well, that's just not how city government works. That's not how any of this process works. So something to that effect, simple, easy to digest literature that residents can see both on our website or if they want to stop by and get it in paper form, that I think would go a long way. Is that kind of what you're trying to address, Councilmember
Yeah, I
Jones?
mean, even to the point where, I got to say it just because it's me, so shocker. I mean, somebody asked about the Bel Air County RE. I mean, is your sanitary sewers line, it's going uphill. Do you have enough capacity? I'm like, I mean, it just, those things suck time and effort out of what the big picture is and what you're alluding to. Yes or no, do you want that or not? And that's really what we're after. So I think that's however we can convey that, yes.
Ms. Crawford, I think you started to say something.
Mayor, members of the council, I agree with everything that's been said. There is some discretion, there is some staff. I don't want to say guidance and give the wrong impression, but guidance, if you will, for the applicant during this concept stage. Both community development staff and myself have been through these work through these processes in other communities. It's not uncommon for the applicant to say, your community, you work here. What do people want to see? What will they value? Is this too much detail? Is this not enough? And I think that we can help guide that. Again, it's just those, it's not to provide any influence, but it's just to gauge that perfect amount for that community meeting.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else on the council have any thoughts?
Great.
Mr. Lindahl, does that give you the feedback you were looking for?
Mayor, members of the council, yes, this has been a great discussion and valuable feedback, and I think we can craft up something formally to take it through, again, that formal process with the Planning Commission and bring it back to you for.
Very good. We look forward to seeing that. All right. Thank you. Moving on to item 10, communication from the city manager. Ms. Crawford.
Mayor, members of the council, I don't have any slides for you tonight, just a verbal update. So we have been putting in shelters at Lions Park. I hope you've all been able to see them, and we're getting very nice feedback on the looks of those, so that's a very visible park in our community. It will nicely put that park together, and thank you to Public Works and Engineering for their hard work on that. Yesterday was election day, right here in council chambers, among other places in the city, and just wanted to publicly say thank you to Ramsey County, who administers our election for us. They do a wonderful job. It was a steady flow of people in here morning through the night, so that's always good to see. Friday is Veterans Day. Non-emergency offices at the city are closed that day, and just want to publicly thank, we employ 11 veterans here at the city, specifically 7 in the police department, 2 in the fire department, and 2 in public works, and just want to publicly thank them for their service, and we certainly appreciate what they have given up for us. And then lastly, in your packet, just council members, mayor, we did have a little memo to you, should you be interested in entertaining electronic meeting packets, like Councilmember Hughes is working on. It greatly reduces staff time, fuel, all of it, paper, everything. So please consider it and let either the city clerk or myself know. That's all I have.
Very good. Thank you. Any questions for Ms. Crawford? Seeing none, I would entertain a motion to adjourn. Do I have a second?
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
We are adjourned. Thank you. That's what I think about it.
5 minutes.
No, but on a serious note.